Greetings, friends of liberty. Presently in England, when crimes are committed against innocent persons, as a rule, 'tis a choice of that injured party whether or not to proceed in court against those who have wronged him. This would usually mean the obligation of gathering and presenting evidence, bringing the case to trial and arguing it in front of a magistrate or judge, though he may also hire a barrister to perform such duties. However, an exception to this necessity of prosecution by individuals was, of course, the Star Chamber. While in the beginning, having functioned only as a court of appeal and against nobles, who otherwise might not have been convicted in lower courts because of their aristocratic privilege, it became instead corrupted under Henry VIII, Old Copper-Nose, and onwards to Charles I, the Martyr. There the court wasn't filled with stars, but rogues in the sovereign's employ, the court initiating proceedings against innumerable persons who had merely committed what the court regarded as unchristian or immoral, but not unlawful acts. In these courts, normal procedures of justice, such as calling witnesses, knowing your accuser, and hiring a barrister to help defend oneself, were forbidden. One of the more notorious instances of these Star Chamber miscarriages were the persecution of the Puritans, who, having had their fill of this intolerance, absconded first to the Netherlands and then the New World. However, return to the instances of prosecutorial injustice in your own 21st century, we find a quite different breed of prosecutors in America, a breed who regard it as their duty to favor the guilty over the innocent. As is now well known, these prosecutorial delinquents feel free to commit enormous amounts of injustice, crimes in themselves, by simply refusing to do their legal duty to prosecute criminals, deliberately abstaining from the pretrial imprisonment or subsequent prosecution of murderers, rapists, and other haters of humanity. They let them go free or let them off with little punishment. Here to examine this most astonishing perversion of normal prosecutorial procedure are two former United States Assistant District Attorneys themselves, Zack and Charles Stimson, who in Rogue Prosecutors describe in great detail 8 instances of these legal criminals and the circumstances of their rise to power. Their book couldn't be more straightforward in its presentation. A first chapter introduces us to these villains. A second describes George Soros' role in helping them become district attorneys. The next 8 chapters describe each one, and the last chapter analyzes the phenomenon and what to do about it. By way of review, let's briefly touch on the highlights or lowlights, as the case may be, of each of these 8 scoundrels, and then examine the author's conclusions. Villain number 1, George Gascon, District Attorney of the City of Los Angeles. Gascon came into office in 2020, partly winning his race against the incompetent Jackie Lacey, when a bunch of BLM protesters picketed Lacey's house, one of them in the middle of the night banging on her front door, and when her husband answered the door holding a handgun, recording his conversation with a smartphone, which viral video in Democratic LA damaged her reputation enough so she lost. As is often the case with these rogues upon assuming office, Gascon immediately worked with lots of professional leftists, as for example, leading proponents of ending cash bail and eliminating the death penalty, anti-incarceration zealots, pro-illegal alien agitators, and prison abolition activists to create an entirely new set of prosecutorial directives for the city. One of these essentially ended cash bail. Another prevented judges trying to set bail from hearing the full criminal history of the accused. Another terminated the 3 strikes policy, which had looked at criminal history. Another removed the death penalty and even attempted to remove it retroactively. Another prohibited a prosecutor's presence at parole hearings, so he couldn't make suggestions or support the victims attending the hearing. Another completely decriminalized a number of misdemeanors like trespassing and driving on a suspended license. And finally, another directed to never charge juveniles as adults. What were some horrific examples of these directives for Angelenos? Among others, that of number 1, Jonathan Madden, who, because as mentioned above, the judge setting his bail didn't know of his previous robberies and burglaries, because Gascon prevented that, gave him low bail, with him paying 10% of that and being released. Just over 6 months later, trying to pass off a counterfeit bill at a Taco Bell, Madden killed the cashier who doubted its authenticity. Number 2, that of Kareem Leiva, a member of the Mexican drug gang MS-13, who murdered by starvation and torture the 4-year-old son of his live-in girlfriend. Leiva had already been eligible for the death penalty, but Gascon had had that removed. Gascon's reputation in LA has increasingly suffered not only because of his deadly policies, with homicides up 41%, violent crime 16%, property crime 8%, and shooting victims up 67% as of June 2022, but also notoriously when, in a press conference, he said of a victim's family who had interrupted his press conference after he wouldn't speak to them that it's unfortunate that some people do not have enough education to keep their mouths shut so we can talk. Note that not only are the many victims of this increased crime wave traumatized by the crime itself, but when justice isn't done, they are traumatized again by the state which fails in its retributive duty. In other words, imagine that a loved one was murdered. That would be one crime. But then imagine that the murderer was treated leniently. That would be a second crime committed by the state against you, since your right to justice was denied. And if that original murder had been caused by these progressive prosecutorial policies, then the state would have injured you twice unnecessarily. Now let's move to villain number 2, District Attorney of the City of Chicago, Kimberly Fox. Fox, of course, is well known for her non-participatory, self-recusing role in the case of the very juicy Jussie Smollett, the race-hoaxing Empire actor who outraged the nation first by pretending to be a victim of MAGA hat-wearing Republicans, those dastards pouring bleach on his poor head in the dead of a cold Chicago winter night when he was just trying to bring home a Subway sandwich to get some food in his hungry black belly, and then by his moronic attempts to deny the hoax, when his co-conspirators, the Ascendero brothers, had long confessed. Jussie's case functioned as a classic political Rorschach test, showcasing how easily the liberal media will entertain any racist claim as long as it's white on black. Just as Smollett, for his part, never admitted his own guilt, Fox, too, continued to maintain her own progressive falsehoods, claiming that, at its worst, the justice system can be easily manipulated in furtherance of thinly veiled political agendas. Smollett was indicted, tried, and convicted by a kangaroo prosecution in a matter of months. Both these individuals illustrate the extent of the human desire to escape the consequences of one's beliefs and actions. Let's briefly review some of her additional lowlights. Number 1. As is often the case with these rogues, they have little experience. Fox herself initially during her campaign had claimed that she had handled about 100 trials, but the reality, as a Freedom of Information Act request discovered, she had handled 2. Number 2. This happened in California in raising the limits of felony shoplifting to 950. So too, Ms. Fox raised it to 1,000. Rob Carr, the president of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, said he was extraordinarily shocked and disappointed, and Fox's rewriting of the laws sends a message that retail theft is victimless and not serious. As a result, retail theft reports skyrocketed up 20% across the city. As with some progressive prosecutors, she vastly reduced the amount of bail needed for dangerous offenders. The result? a 45% increase in general crimes committed by defendants released, and a 33% increase in violent crimes. Regarding murders, in the 2 years before Fox was elected state's attorney, there were 425 and 493 homicides, respectively. Right after Fox was elected, homicides in Chicago were 778 and 660. A final comment on Ms. Fox. One of the oddest facts about all these progressive prosecutors is how grievously they harm minority communities, yet how long it takes liberals to recognize and react to that obvious fact. The national murder rate across the country in 2019 was 5.0 per 100,000 residents. In Chicago, the rate in 2019 was 18.2. But in the 10 most violent sections of the city in 2019, where between 90 and 98% of the residents are either Black or Latino, the homicide rates ranged from 40.8 to 131.9. Let's now move to villain number 3, Larry Krasner of Philly. Lowlight number 1. When Krasner assumed the district attorney's role, he immediately, in effect, decriminalized misdemeanors dealing with prostitution and marijuana, reduced bail required by a defendant by charging them with a lesser than a more serious crime, requested shorter probation and parole periods and no more than 6 months for a technical parole violation, and finally set enormously high bail amounts, such as asking judges for $999,999 bail and then, when they, as expected, lowered the bail to a normal amount. If the defendant subsequently committed a crime, Krasner then claimed it was the judge's fault because he lowered the bail. Number 2, Krasner's most notorious failure in the city of brotherly love was named Hassan Elliott. When district attorney, he let Hassan off after serving 7 months for threatening a neighbor with a gun. And when he was subsequently caught with cocaine, let him off without serving any time, even though this was a parole violation. Then when Hassan murdered someone and officers went to arrest him, he shot one and killed him. Number 3, what were the general results of Krasner's policies? In the 5 years after he took office, on average per year, 3,027 Philadelphians were shot, compared to 1,302 in the 2 years before he assumed office, a difference of over 1,700 per year. Similarly, per year, 461 people on average were murdered from 2018 to 2022 in his first 5 years, but only 271 per year in the 5 years before he took office, a difference of 190 per year. On to villain number 4, St. Louis's Kim Gardner. You maybe remember Kim is the DA who charged the attorney couple, the McCloskeys, who came out with their weapons to stand on their porch as a BLM crowd marched by their home and through their gated community. Her lowlights in St. Louis include, number 1, simply not showing up for numerous hearings or trials, with the result that in one case, for example, A, a murder charge was dismissed, B, the murderer was released from jail, she lying that he hadn't been, and C, a U.S. Marshals task force had to again track him, arrest him, and return him back to custody. 2, like many other rogues, she cleaned house of the experienced prosecutors who had staffed her office, eliminating more than 470 years of criminal prosecutorial experience. There was also more than 100% turnover in her office, perhaps because, as one former official of Gardner's office said, she just has zero project management experience and no willingness to trust people who do have that experience. She also at one point hired a private investigator to do police work. Number 3, the number of felony cases dismissed by the DA's office in her tenure increased by over 30%, from 10 to 16% before her. Next, Boston's Rachel Rawlins. The authors regard Rawlins as the least bad, but she gets included because of her woke statements and her racialization of the DA's office. She was famous for Number 1, putting out the famous Rachel Rawlins policy memo upon entering office, which outraged citizens and police alike by listing 15 crimes that should be declined or dismissed prearrangement without conditions. These included trespassing, shoplifting, larceny under $250, receiving stolen property, and wanton or malicious destruction of property. Number 2, Rawlins gained her greatest notoriety when Boston had outbreaks of violence during the George Floyd riots. Greater outbreaks than usually peaceful Boston had seen for decades, with crowds assaulting police officers and vandalizing storefronts. What did she tweet as Boston's DA at 10:20 p.m., about an hour after the violence had started? Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Christian Cooper. While we are being murdered at will by the police and their proxy privileged racists like Amy Cooper play the victim. No more apologies, no more words, demand action, radical change now, nothing less. She later reinforced her statement saying, people are fed up, and to the white community that is now waking up to see this rage, we've been telling you this forever. You didn't care until you saw a video. This is why some call her Rachel Rawlins. The Boston Police Patrolmen's Association responded by saying, by calling officers murderers, she undoubtedly incited violence against police and put the lives of police officers at risk as they patrolled the streets of Boston. You can see here the truly despicable nature of these DAs. Moving right along, let's proceed now to villain number 6, San Fran's Chesa Boudin. Partially famous because his parents were, of course, two violent members of the Weather Underground, and he was raised, while they were in the can, by terrorists Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers. Boudin distinguished himself by getting kicked out of office after only a little over 2 years on the job, and by, number 1, making so little effort to pursue criminals that by the end of 2021, citizens of San Francisco had reported 20,663 thefts from vehicles, a 39% increase from the previous year. Mostly car owners just let their windows down and trunk open, since that way at least the car wouldn't be damaged when the thieves took their belongings. Number 2, by so little prosecuting retail theft that thieves would actually bike through stores filling black garbage bags with goods then peddling right out the door to make their getaway. Number 3, by responding to criticism of flash mobs breaking into stores by saying, it happens in other cities too. Number 4, by claiming that most traditional prosecutors don't want to believe that an outsider like me, a career public defender, knows better than they do how to be a prosecutor, because he understands better than they that criminals are three-dimensional people. Number 5, and finally, by the infamous case of Troy McAllister. McAllister, who faced a certain life in jail in 2019 for yet another robbery, since he had already committed 2 previous robberies, a carjacking, and numerous additional serious felonies. All these crimes were disregarded by Boudin, who again could have used them to put McAllister away for a long time. Instead, he let him off with time served. Over the next 7 months, McAllister then used his freedom to commit, among other lesser crimes, another burglary and 2 more car thefts. Aside from spending 11 days in jail, Boudin let him go free for all these additional crimes, with the result that, on New Year's 2020, driving a stolen car while drunk, and after having committed a burglary, McAllister ran a red light, killing 2 pedestrians. This was finally too much to bear even for liberal San Franciscans, and Boudin was subject to a successful recall. Last but not least, let's briefly mention villains numbers 7 and 8, Baltimore's Marilyn Mosby and New York's Alvin Bragg. In Baltimore, homicides, which averaged 229 per year in the 5 years before she took office, averaged 331 per year afterwards. Rapes were up from 292 to 330, robberies up 1,508 per year, and aggravated assaults up 562. The wages of progressivism are death and destruction. In New York, with smooth-talking Bragg, who, when entering office like Rawlins in Boston and Gascon in L.A., published a new list of minor crimes that he wouldn't prosecute, we see similar numbers. Precinct Manhattan South saw, after 2 years, murders up 100%, rapes up 35.8%, robberies 85.8%, felony assaults 41.9%, burglaries 13.2%, grand larcenies 70.6%, and grand larceny autos up 51.9%. So that concludes our review of the specific policies of these 8 scoundrels. I would give the authors a B+, given that the book is well written, very comprehensive, and well informed by their own prosecutorial experience. The one presentational drawback to the 486-page Kindle version is that because it is so comprehensive, it can become a bit tedious. Are there any major problems? Not really, but some minor ones. Let's briefly examine these. First, the authors constantly avoid using the term progressive in describing these prosecutors, instead, as we see in their title, using words like rogue and radical. This avoidance reminds me of those classical liberals loath to give up the word liberal, which used to mean classical liberal, but now means, well, liberal. Number 2. A more important problem arises in their discussion of the nature and causes of violent crime. They focus on 2 issues. While quickly disposing of the myth that America has a racist criminal justice system, their treatment of whether mass incarceration occurs in America runs into problems. They argue here that while there are about 2.3 million convicts at any one time, given that many are on parole, only about 1.4 million are actually in prison, with about 1.1 million of those being in state prisons. And they argue that, while it's commonly believed that many nonviolent drug offenders make up the American prison population, the reality is that the percentage of these nonviolent inmates only there for drug possession make up somewhere between 10 to 20%. So, for example, there are 89% of prisoners in state prison and 11% in federal prison. If we removed the nonviolent drug offenders from the state system, they argue we would be removing about 145,000 people, bringing the state system down from 1,078,700 to 933,000. That's still a lot of people, though. 150,000 people locked in cages because they simply possessed drugs not approved by the state, but weren't violent. But if we grant them that the number of nonviolent drug users is much lower than commonly understood, again, somewhere between 10 to 20%, then their main argument is that the enormous increase in the prison population from the 60s on, maybe 5 times or more greater, until now, is due to the enormous increase in crime to which locking violent people up is a rational response. But there's one big problem with their argument: the drug war. They completely fail to recognize that violent crime partly increased enormously from the 60s to the 90s, after which it started falling for almost 30 years, precisely because the drug war intensified. As I've mentioned in other videos, the rates of homicide after alcohol prohibition was repealed in the U.S. in 1933 dropped by half in the next 12 years. Similarly, everywhere we look, we see that countries that are affected by the drug war, such as Mexico and Colombia with their powerful and violent drug cartels, have enormously increased rates of homicide and general violence, in Mexico presently destabilizing whole regions of the country. It's also a fact that drug addicts, because the drug war makes drugs much more expensive, in the case of cocaine something like 20 times more, that some addicts are known to commit hundreds of burglaries or robberies to feed their habits, or they prostitute themselves or engage in other crime, all of which will be unnecessary if drugs were legal, and all of which has resulted in an enormous increase in the number incarcerated for crimes they otherwise never would have committed. So, for example, when they point out that Many, if not most, gun homicides in the United States are committed by armed felons or gang members who use unlawfully obtained handguns to murder other individuals. That's exactly right. Get rid of drug gangs, cartels, and organized crime generally by legalizing activities people have a right to do, and homicide rates and the general crime rates would plunge and organized crime would be greatly weakened. Additionally, let all qualified citizens have a gun, and rates of violence, as John Lott has shown, would drop even further. History gives excellent evidence that this is true, since in the United States, homicide rates in 1900, before the drug war and gun control ramped up, were a small fraction of what they are today, somewhere between 1 to 2 homicides per 100,000, whereas now it ranges from 5 to 10. So in summary, this book gives outstanding coverage of the subject it focuses on, even if the Kindle version at 486 pages becomes a bit tedious at times, and even if they make some mistakes in their understanding of the causes of societal violence, and thus the greatly increased and ultimately unnecessary incarceration rates. And now, happy to be living in late 18th century England, where the Star Chamber with its rogue prosecutors has finally been dissolved, and the state doesn't let armies of violent ruffians go free, while actually encouraging citizens to aid the constabulary in catching criminals by raising a hue and cry, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.